Welcome everybody to this joint workshop from Green Christian and the Tertiary Franciscans. It's absolutely delightful to be doing this together with some lovely people, all of you lovely people, and Thomas, Philippa, and Jenny and Paul, who I'm just going to introduce. So Thomas is the CEO of WWF Switzerland and Franciscan Tertiary, and he's passionate about nature and has supported WWF since he was 8 years old. Before joining the organisation professionally, he worked for Citibank and McKinsey and Company. Thomas and his family live in Zurich, from where he enjoys exploring nature on land and underwater. It's fantastic. Welcome to Thomas, and now welcome to Philippa. Philippa Bird is convener of the Third Order's Creation, Justice, Peace Network, which operates across Europe and involves around 2,000 tertiaries. And she's been a Franciscan in London since 1989. Paul Bodenham is a former chair of Green Christian for 15 years. Two of us, he did such a splendid job that none of us felt we could step into his shoes. So two of us took on co-chair after him. And he's also a Tertiary Franciscan. And he said in a meeting a few days ago that he was bringing together his two worlds this evening, which is a rather lovely thing. Paul also runs Caritas, which is the social and environmental action agency in the Roman Catholic Diocese of Nottingham. As well as being a Franciscan tertiary, he's creation, justice and peace advocate for the Franciscans in the East Midlands. And finally, Jenny Owen is also a member of the Creation, Justice and Peace Steering Group and has been a professed tertiary since 2000. And she's passionate about our kinship with all of God's creation and issues of social and international justice. So I think you'll all agree we have a splendid panel this evening, and it's going to be an absolutely wonderful workshop. Just to remind you that there's such neglect about biodiversity, and it's been neglected alongside climate change. Climate is one of these big things that people talk about, but biodiversity is one of those things that people sort of forget about. Very important. And it's going to be given the priority it deserves this evening. So I will just hand you over now to Philippa for prayer. Thank you.
O Creator God, we praise you for the wonderful gift of creation and its diversity, the way it all fits together into a harmonious whole, and the way it gives life to all its creatures. But we have not looked after this world. We have trashed it and exploited it for ourselves. All are suffering. Lord, forgive us. We pray that leaders may continue to emerge to promote and execute strategies that will save our planet, and that they will enthuse ordinary people so that all may do their bit on an everyday basis. Bless the discussions and meetings of COP15. May there be a true meeting of minds, a willingness to give and take, and a commitment to doing whatever is necessary. Bless our endeavours, that we may bring the glory and justice of creation before you on the earth again. Amen.
Thank you very much, Philippa. I think you're going to now give an introduction to the Franciscan concern for biodiversity.
That's right, thank you. What I'm going to briefly do is talk about Francis and a diverse creation, and to take us from a radical 13th century saint to somebody who has become the 21st century patron saint of ecology. How many bird baths have you seen? Some will have featured St. Francis, usually with a couple of birds in the vicinity, a typical portrait of the saint who loved animals and preached to the birds. An image in art captured as early as the Giotto paintings in the Basilica in Assisi. But Francis was much more than this. His complexity and understanding was acknowledged earlier this century when the Pope appointed him the Saint of Ecology. Francis believed that God had created a rich tapestry in creation where everything was interconnected. He saw parity between humans and animals. He did not confine this view to living beings, but also embraced the inanimate, rocks, water, and fire, to name a few. His Canticle of the Creatures speaks of brother wind, the air cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through whom you give sustenance to your creatures. Sister water, who is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with coloured flowers and herbs. All part of the essentials in our world that we seem hell-bent on destroying or misusing. Francis cared for what today we call the environment. For example, he left wild margins when sowing and harvesting in a field. He encouraged pollinators such as Brother Bee and advised those pruning trees to leave enough shoots for regrowth. Francis encountered and interacted with a diverse range of animals: birds, sheep, wolves, mice, slugs, fishes, to name but a few. All were addressed as brothers and sisters, even Brother Worm, whom Francis avoided stepping on. As Simon Coxedge writes, Francis saw a universal fraternity, all in a respectful relationship that was non-possessive. Different words, but related concepts, all different, but all similar. A 13th century viewpoint of sustainability from a saint of his creator God, and a 21st century crisis of human making across the globe. Yet we still have hope. As the TSSF principles state, drawing on St. Paul, when we are weak, then we are strong.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself again. Thank you so much, Philippa. That was lovely, kind of meditative introduction. Barbara, you're going to give us now an introduction to Green Christian's concern for biodiversity.
Will do, Deborah, yes. Biodiversity has always been in our DNA. Our original name was Christian Ecology Link. But one reason we changed to Green Christian is the word ecology was not understood widely enough for instant recognition. Green is immediately recognized. It may not be welcome, but people know what it means. While biodiversity has been included all along the way with us, we've tended to focus on other issues: climate, food with our Use Your Loaf campaign, economics with Joy and Enough. But over the years, one of the people on our call today, Dr. Judith Allinson, who some of you will know as our web editor who sends out e-news, she has been our constant Green Christian CEL biodiversity prophet, reminding us we must show that Christians really do care about wildlife, God's gift to us and future generations. Judith set up and still runs the Rainforest Fund. It's a virtual fund in that money raised to save threatened habitat goes directly to other charities, mostly World Land Trust, Cool Earth, and A Rosh Hashanah. Donors can choose which one of those, or choose one with similar aims. If a church donates £100 or more to a habitat-saving charity, Judith adds them to the list of active churches on our website. Her aim is to have 100 churches eventually having made a £100 plus donation. She raises funds herself by selling handmade greeting cards with beautiful wildlife photos on them. In addition, we have a biodiversity leaflet, but the plight of the natural world is not being given, as Deborah said, as much special attention as it deserves, which is why, with the now sadly postponed UN COP15, due to happen this autumn, but now just a technical meeting this autumn and the in-person postponed to next spring, I think in May. Anyway, with that coming up, as we thought, we decided to run a joint workshop with Third Order Franciscans this evening, with a follow-up workshop in a couple of weeks' time. So, Thomas, I'm looking forward to hearing you, learning from your wisdom on how we at Green Christian can do more to give emphasis to this important part of our work. So I'll hand over to Paul, who I think is going to introduce you.
Thanks, Barbara. Well, I guess you need no further introduction, Thomas, but I just want to pick up on that phrase that Barbara used with Judith, actually, of biodiversity needing profits. I think we've learnt what it means to be prophetic around the climate crisis, and we've seen that, for instance, with for instance, the Youth Climate Change Network relay going from the G7 Cornwall right up to Glasgow, that kind of thing. I think we're used to people trying to make an impact on that. It's much harder to be a prophet around biodiversity. And one of the things that really excites me about hearing from you, Thomas, is that you actually circulate in the context where prophecy really hits the ground in the sort of with boardrooms and business. And I having seen your kind of CV on the internet, I can see that you've got a lot of experience in actually where the rubber hits the road on these issues. So I think for everybody else's benefit, I think we're going to hear something which is both inspiring and galvanizing, but also really grips the road, as it were, and takes account of the forces that we are having to negotiate with in order to reverse that trend of decline. So I think without further ado, Thomas, I'll invite you to unmute, and after we've heard from Thomas, we'll have time for breakout rooms, which I'll introduce some questions for, and then some Q&A. Oh, sorry, we've got Q&A actually before we break up, and some breakouts. Yeah, so plenty of time for interaction to sort of thrash through what Thomas is going to share. Thanks, Thomas. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, Barbara, and Paul, for that introduction. Thank you for having me on the call today. No pressure there about sharing my wisdom and things like that. We'll see, but I'll certainly share something, and I'll start by trying to share my screen, which is always the first challenge on these occasions. So, Kindred in Creation, maybe I should just say something before I get into the content, which is I'm speaking today in a private function, not as CEO of WWF Switzerland. That's important for me because, well, first of all, it allows me to include topics which otherwise I wouldn't include in a presentation. And also because speaking to a UK-based audience, I'm somewhat outside my jurisdiction as CEO of WWF Switzerland. So just take this as my personal view, and if you want to know more about specifically what WWF thinks on a certain issue, then do by all means ask me. I thought I'd start with this picture of mangroves. And mangroves, of course, are a wonderful habitat which is very, very threatened. They're also, I chose them because they're at the intersection between the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. They're incredibly important in sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it. But at the same time, they're spawning grounds for countless species, so they're ecologically incredibly important. And I chose it because very often we think of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis as sort of two separate issues. And of course, they're not. They're incredibly closely connected, and we really need to address them as one ecological crisis. And if we are to address them successfully. So I'll get around to more of that, but that was just important to me as a couple of words of introduction there. So let me, what I'd like to talk about is three things. Briefly about sort of how do we frame this ecological crisis, and I've started on that a little bit with what I've been saying. Then how do we move from awareness to action? And then a third part about what I've called connecting and inspiring, which is more specifically about what is the role, or what could the role be for churches, for faith-based groups in addressing the ecological crisis. So on the first topic of understanding the ecological crisis, the aim here isn't to sort of shock you into action, if you will. I'm convinced that doesn't work, firstly, and secondly, I know you already know a lot about this, so I don't want to bore you with too much on sort of background. But I thought I would start with this picture here, this graph, which some of you may know. It's the Living Planet Index, which is published every other year by the Zoological Society of London and WWF. And what it shows is it's an aggregate of population data from over 4,000 different species, more than 20,000 different populations around the world, and it's simply aggregating that into one number. So it's basically counting animals, counting vertebrates. And what it shows is the rather disturbing figure that on average, these populations have declined by 68% in the last roughly 45 years. So a very dramatic picture, one which is also unique in the history of our planet. We've never had this kind of rapid reduction of population numbers before, except when meteorites strike and things like that. So it's a very unique moment in a negative way in which we are, and I think it's important to kind of see that sort of historical backdrop against which we deal with this crisis. So that's sort of the numbers out of the way, if you will. We publish this Living Planet Index every other year in a report called the Living Planet Report, which covers a lot of other things as well, and which gets quite a lot of media attention whenever it comes out. The interesting thing is it's only really gathered media attention in the last 2 or 3 years. But if you look at when we first published it, it actually first came out in 2000. And of course, you know, the data's become more advanced, the pictures become a lot more serious. But it's interesting that something like that has been around in the public realm for 20 years. And, you know, it's only really just started to get major traction. So I think that's an interesting sort of point in time to reflect on why is that. And excuse my German. This is a title page of a Swiss daily newspaper, quite a conservative newspaper, which came out about 2 years ago with a headline reading 1 million species are threatened with extinction. Of course, this was following the IPBES report, which was drawing together much of this data which was around. And that in many ways was a turning point where the biodiversity crisis became much more sort of part of, well, the public spotlight and public discourse. So what happened? Why all of a sudden did this happen? IPBES helped having this data, but I think there's actually something much more profound behind it. And I think it has something to do with an understanding which has been growing for a number of years, but which is much more pronounced today than it was 10 years ago, that we are not separate from nature. And if nature gets into trouble, we get into trouble. And maybe it's just our selfish instincts, but that makes a big difference. And I'll give you a quote. This is from, oh no, I'll show you something else first. This is something which the World Economic Forum publishes every year, called their Global Risk Report or Risk Perception Survey. And what they look at is they ask their members, so these are largely major corporations around the world, they ask them, what are the biggest risks to your business by impact and by likelihood? And this is interesting. It's 10 years of data. It starts at the bottom, that's 2012. The most recent year, 2021, is at the top. And you don't have to be able to read these, but just look at the colors. Green are environmental risks. And if you go back to 2012, you have one among 10 major risks, one which was environmental, which was greenhouse gas emissions. Fast forward to 2021, and you've got 7 out of 10, which are environmental risks. So this has really crept up on the agenda of major corporations around the world. And you also see there that for the last 2 or 3 years, biodiversity loss is among those both the most likely and the most impactful risks. So again, something has started to change here, and it's starting, and it's changing quite rapidly. Little side note, last year, the 5 most likely risks were environmental risks. This year, there are only 4 and 1 additional, which isn't environmental. And it won't take you long to guess what it is. It's infectious diseases. It didn't show up any time before that. So it just sort of shows you how forward-looking many business leaders are. But anyway, they've caught on to the fact that something's happening to the environment and that this is a risk for their business. Or as this gentleman said, James Gorman, CEO of the bank Morgan Stanley, he said, if we don't have a planet, we're not going to have a very good financial system. Now, I've not made up my mind if that's incredibly banal or incredibly wise, but it's good to hear a banker realize that, because if a banker feels that the financial system is threatened, then they'll do something about it. Never mind the planet being threatened, but if the banking system is threatened, then it starts really getting into the mainstream. So I think that's an important thing. But I don't want to sound cynical about this, or not too cynical. I think there's something profoundly human about realizing the connection between nature and humans, or us being part of nature. And I wanted to show you this picture, which is our daughter Sarah. A couple of years ago, she's an unruly teenager now. But she allowed me to use this picture of her with my polar bear in her arms, and I think it's a nice picture to kind of symbolize what's been going on. That people have increasingly realized that, things like climate change, things like biodiversity loss, they don't just threaten the polar bears of this planet, but they threaten our children. And we are mammals, so we are programmed to look after our young. And if something threatens our children, that can really set free quite incredible energies in us. And it's not a right-left issue. And we find we get a lot of people joining WWF when they first have a child, because that sort of extends their horizon in terms of, 2050 doesn't sound all that far away. When you have a little child, so it changes something. I've heard this more and more, that this is something that people have been realizing. So that's just my theory. I think there's some of that behind this greater attention that we give biodiversity today. And then there's this. These are 2 members of an indigenous people in the Amazon. This is after the terrible forest fires of 2 years ago. And, you lose biodiversity. And for many years, people felt, well, we lose the tigers, it's kind of sad, but it doesn't exactly it doesn't really change my daily life. Well, for these people, they lose biodiversity, they lose the basis of their livelihood. So it's an existential crisis for many people on this planet, and it's for the poorest that are most touched by, and again, it's this dual crisis of climate change and of biodiversity loss. So I think we should never forget that there's this link to humans, and that's changed a lot in how we think of this crisis. So that's just kind of how I wanted to frame this a bit, that you understand that biodiversity's really moved up the agenda. It was nowhere for years, but now it's really up there with some of the top issues, and it's getting a lot of attention these days, thank goodness. So, okay, how do we move from awareness is good, but how do we move from awareness to action? And I don't want to spend too much time on this because this would be a talk for itself. But what I wanted to suggest to you is just a very simple framework of how you might think about this, which is, we can make lifestyle choices, personal lifestyle choices. We can take community action in our churches, in our local communities, and we can hold decision makers to account. And there's a lot of debate about, well, forget about lifestyle choices. It's all about holding decision makers to account. And others say, no, it's about everyone has to be the change they want to see in the world, and so on. And there's this futile debate about what is right. And what I would argue is you really need to look at this in an integrated way. And to think about this and where you can and want to act. It's not one of them's right and the other one's wrong. And on the other axis, what you have is just, and this is my choice of areas which I think are particularly relevant, both, again, in terms of climate change and biodiversity crisis. So it's what we eat, it's how we live, it's how we move about, it's how we invest our savings. And then there's that sort of odd one out about how we basically use the land and sea in this planet, and do we rewilder some areas and give space to nature? And what I would suggest, and these are just a few, I've called them suggested do's and don'ts, is as you think of those different levels you can act and those different areas you can act in, my suggestion would be combine action at different levels. Pick some lifestyle choices you want to make, pick some community action, pick some holding decision makers to account. It's not one or the other. If I want to lobby for change, and I give a talk on climate change or biodiversity crisis, and I drive up in my SUV, I'm not going to be a very credible spokesperson for what I do. So those things are really closely linked, I think. My second point here is, pick a small number of relevant actions to focus on. Don't try and do everything. You're not going to do yourself a favor. You're not going to be doing the cause a favor, because I think you're just going to burn out. And the third point here, I think, is important. Don't try to get all your personal lifestyle choices right. That can be a real stress. I was interviewed when I started my job as CEO. A newspaper asked me about, whether I was doing everything the right way, and I said I'm not an ecological hero, and I explained that that there are several areas where I could do things better than I am, and I was very aware of that. And that's still something I say. I try to phrase it slightly differently, because of course the newspaper then took that phrase and used it as the title over their article. Thomas Vellacott, not an environmental hero. But anyway, I think the point is important, that don't beat yourself up if you don't get everything right. Make a few big choices, and that's usually the best you can do. And finally, don't despair. And I'll come back to this in a moment. I meet people who, basically it feels like they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Again, that can destroy lives. And this is not a sprint. This is a marathon we're running. So we need to sort of pace ourselves and make sure we don't burn out. And that's not just rosy thinking or positive thinking. It's, if you look at how societal change happens, You know, one is it's obviously the sum of many small changes. It's not usually one big change. And secondly, change is rarely linear. You know, it's S-curves basically. So for a long time you don't notice anything, and then all of a sudden the thing explodes and goes through the roof. That's how most change happens. Linear change is actually very rare. And we somehow expect linear change and get frustrated when we don't see linear change. So that's just a few points on sort of taking action. And again, we could discuss a lot about this, I'm sure. Then, oh yes, I mean, I've already made this point, just again, not to separate between climate and biodiversity. I think it's just, you know, nature doesn't do it. You know, climate change is a huge risk for biodiversity. Biodiversity loss is a huge risk for nature. They're just so incredibly closely connected. And, you know, if forests are burnt down in Brazil or in Malaysia for agricultural land, that is terrible for biodiversity and that is terrible for climate. So we need to do something about it. So we just sort of have to get over this intellectual divide of it's either one or the other. And if people try to force you into a false dichotomy between, well, you can either do something which is good for climate or biodiversity, but you can't have your cake and eat it, you can't have both, challenge them on that, because usually that's a false dichotomy. So we sometimes get that here in Switzerland when people will say, well, you can't be against wind power, and we say, well, we're not in general against wind power, but if you put it in the wrong place and end up slicing birds, then we're against it. You know, it's about making the right choices and looking at issues from both the biodiversity lens and through the climate lens. So let me get to the third and final section of my talk about what I've called connecting and inspiring. And I'd like to go a little bit deeper into this, our relationship with nature, because I think actually in addition to those levers which I showed you, you know, the food, the housing, the investing and so on, I think there's actually an additional lever which we don't often talk about, which is our relationship with nature. How do we think about nature? How do we think about us in relationship to nature? And I've sort of put it as a frame around the other ones because I wouldn't know if I had to put it right at the sort of the most personal, because it's even more personal than my lifestyle choices, or at the most universal, because it's even more universal than holding decision makers to account. So it's sort of on a different level, maybe. It's almost sort of something that happens in the background, but that drives a lot of the choices we make on those other levers. And let me explain a bit more what I mean by this. So this is WWF's mission to stop the degradation of the planet's natural environment and to build a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. That mission has been basically unchanged for about 30 years. And it's a good mission. It's, you know, I've been around for almost 20 years in WWF now. So I identify with this mission. But there's something that I trip over each time I read it, which is the phrase, a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. And the piece that bothers me, or that doesn't quite agree with my understanding, is that for me, humans are part of nature, and we shouldn't be thinking of us here and nature there. And, you know, we either trash nature or we care for nature, but, you know, we are talking about one and the same system here. So, you know, I'm not suggesting WWF will change this soon, but I'm getting more and more feedback from people, not just from WWF, but outside, who very much have this, well, you know, it's not about just good stewardship, it's about being part of this thing called nature. And I wanted to show you this. It's a campaign we ran a few years ago. It just reads, protect the world in which our children are born, into which our children are born. What we did is I mentioned that a lot of members join us when they first have children. And what we did is we wrote to our members and said, look, you know, we would like to run this campaign. We'd like to take pictures, and we did videos as well. And we're looking for couples who are about to have a child. And we invited them, and, you know, we did the photo shoot. So these are WWF members with their children. And the lady wasn't sitting in an icy grotto. But the most fascinating part about the campaign for me was when we asked them why they had become WWF members, or why they were becoming active for the environment. And they were describing that in terms of taking care of their children. And it was such a fundamental human emotion that it just came across incredibly strongly, listening to these young people describe what sort of a future they wanted for their children. And again, you know, this is about connecting. This is about our connection with nature. This is about our connection with the future generations. And I'd like to read a short passage from an article which was published in the New York Times a few months ago about the last 2 northern white rhinos on Earth. It speaks about the biodiversity crisis and extinction. It's about a species which has basically gone extinct. The last bull died 2 years ago. There are still 2 females alive, but they're basically living dead. They're going to be the last one of their kind. And I showed you the numbers. I showed you the Living Planet Index and all that. But pay attention to the language which is used here. It's very, very different, and it's language which speaks to a lot of people because it's not the scientific language. It's something slightly different. So in May, that was my computer, which was about to give up. So in May 2019, just over a year after the death of Sudan, that was the last bull, the United Nations issued an apocalyptic report about mass extinction. This is the IPBES study I referred to earlier. 1 million plant and animal species, it warned, were at risk of annihilation. This obviously was a horror. Mass extinction is the ultimate crisis, doom of all dooms, the disaster towards which all other disasters flow. What could humans do that would be worse than killing the life around us irreversibly at scale? 1 million species, a number so large exceeds the mind. It becomes, as Albert Camus put it in The Plague, a puff of smoke in the imagination. And yet we cannot allow ourselves to forget the reality concealed by that puff of smoke. 1 million is not just a number. It contains countless living creatures, individual frogs, bats, turtles, tigers, bees, eels, puffins, owls. Each one as real as you or me, each with its own life story and family ties and collection of habits. That's a very different relationship which is being described here. This is very close to what Philippa read out when Francis called creation brothers and sisters. This is kinship for me. So this is what it's about. And how do we bring this debate to this level where we touch people because they start to understand what is at stake, and it's not just the numbers. And I think that's where faiths have a unique role to play. And I just wanted to bring up this something called the Assisi Declarations, which is a document which was published in 1986. That was a summit. It came out of a summit which took place in Assisi. Prince Philip, who was our president at the time, played an important role in gathering together the faiths. And each major faith gave a declaration where they made the link between their faith and creation and the need to look after creation. That's just one example, but I think this fills a void which a secular organization like WWF can't fill. This is where we need to go to a spiritual level, which we feel incredibly uncomfortable doing as WWF. Because it's all about science, but I think that's a niche which faiths can play an incredibly important role. And just to finish up with, I said connecting and inspiring, and I want to end on the inspiring piece because I meet a lot of people who are desperate because of what's happening and because of the inadequacy of the action they're seeing, and I'm the last person to want to diminish the gravity of the crisis that's out there. But I think it's important we also see the change that is happening, and we don't get much of that because media don't like reporting on this. It's boring news, you know. It's crime sells and crises sells. But if you actually look for it, you start seeing it. It's things like, you know, the mayor of Paris turning large parts of Paris into gardens, and you know, massively extending pedestrian areas. Things like, it's not just Paris, you know, it's Bogota, it's places around the world. So you start sort of seeing these things. Or you start seeing articles like this one in Forbes, so in a very business magazine, that reported that 70% of the world population is reporting that they're either reducing meat consumption or leaving meat off the table altogether. And this isn't sort of some mumbo jumbo report. This is Global Data, a company that, you know, works with 4,000 of the world's largest companies, reporting this data. So we're starting to see this, and that doesn't diminish the crisis, but it just shows that something is happening and something is possible. No, I'll end with this picture. I'll give you a few suggested do's and don'ts first. So on this third section, what I'd argue is, you know, I think it's important we don't treat biodiversity loss as a purely scientific issue. It is a scientific issue, but it's more than that. Recognize that for many people, it's a deeply personal, even spiritual question. So we also need to address that level of the crisis. I think we should draw on the rich traditions we have in our faith in addressing the biodiversity loss. It's important, obviously, we don't make this about one faith. This is about connecting with people of other faith traditions or no faith traditions. It's about connecting with indigenous people and the incredible wealth they have. And it's about speaking about the spiritual dimension of the ecological crisis, because that can really help to inspire action. I won't have to tell you, but it's important that we're not preachy about this, because, you know, for many people, the church is the last institution they would look to for inspiration when it comes to addressing the ecological crisis, because they see the church as sort of complicit in a lot of the horrific events of the last couple of 100 years. So I think it's important we are humble in how we approach this, and don't try to thrust our spiritual wisdom down people's throats. And the final point is, let's not try to scare people into action. I started with that. Let's speak about the full extent of the ecological crisis, but let's also point out the positive developments when we address it, because there's a sweet spot between not caring and giving up because you're desperate. And it's that sweet spot where people feel inspired to take action. And I think that's what we need to aim for. And I wanted to end with this picture of this wonderful female tiger and her 3 cubs. This is in Nepal, and she had actually disappeared off the radar. She hadn't been recorded by any camera traps for a couple of years, and everyone had thought that she'd been, she'd perished or she'd been poached. And then this shows up in a camera trap, this picture. Not just was she alive, but she had 3 young cubs. And every tiger is unique, so you can identify them. They have their own little barcode, which is unique to each and every animal. So it's things like that, and it's not just an individual case. Tiger numbers have almost doubled in the last 10 years. That's a figure we'll release next year. So this isn't a one-way street. We can turn these trends around, and we've shown that we can turn them around if we take decisive action. And it's important we tell that story as well. And to get back to the Living Planet Index, which I showed, those 68% decline, another way to present the exact same data is to say that 50% of populations of animals are declining and 50% are increasing. That's still a very dramatic picture, having a 50% of populations declining. But it shows you that species are also coming back from the brink of extinction. And I think that's something that can inspire hope and that we don't talk enough about. Thank you. And that's where I'll end and hand it back.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, Paul, Thomas. That's just a lovely very comprehensive, although only a few minutes, but very comprehensive insight into where you are personally, as well as the science. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We're going to move now into small groups, which are we? Oh, sorry, am I looking at the wrong bit? I'm looking at the wrong bit.
We've got 10 minutes for just questions that anybody
10 minutes
wants
for questions,
to,
sorry, 10 minutes for questions. That's right, 10 minutes for questions, then we'll move into small groups to have a chat. Questions, yeah. The first one that I spotted was somebody who asked, do you agree with the thinkers who say that infectious diseases are linked to our poor care of creation?
Yes, they are. It's quite established science that so zoonotic diseases that jump from one species to another and then to humans have greatly increased, and they've increased in line with as we go deeper into natural habitats. And we bring our livestock into those deforested areas, for example, and there's much more proximity between our livestock and wild animals such as bats, which are often, of course, intermittent species there in transferring these diseases. So there is a very clear link there, and it's just one of these ways in which we're understanding how closely the two are linked. So the World Health Organization speaks about One Health, that planetary health and human health are closely linked. And if we want one, we have to look after the other. And I think that's something which is coming through more and more.
And just to follow that up, are there things that we specifically could be doing, do you think, on that? Because it's such a huge thing and it seems to be out of our hands. Is there anything we could specifically be doing ourselves as individuals, do you think, apart from perhaps lobbying?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's one where you can't do that much directly unless you live on a plot that is partially forested by tropical rainforest and are grazing cattle, in which case you could do something directly. But this is one which I think it's about creating the awareness. And I mean, this isn't new, this science, it's not something we know just since COVID. It's been around for a while. But I think it's important we talk about these things because you reach a different audience than you would if you're just talking to the panda lovers and the tiger lovers. So I think that's an important thing we can do. And yes, then we can, lobby for deforestation-free supply chains, for example, from supermarkets or from governments to put in place safeguards against that kind of thing.
Yes, that makes lots of sense. Somebody asked a question about change. You mentioned change being rarely linear, and I recognise that personally. You're quite right, things sometimes just suddenly explode. And Anne asked, is it donut? Do you know this term about donut economics?
Yes.
So, yes. Do you think it could be donut sometimes, rippling out perhaps?
Donut economics is a very useful way of thinking about boundaries. So if you think of a donut with a hole in the middle, the outer limit of the donut are the planetary boundaries. So what we're saying there basically is, there's only this much natural resources on our planet, and if you overuse them and nature can't reproduce them in time, then we're running into trouble. So we can't go over those outer boundaries. The inner boundary of the donut is the social dimension. So how can we ensure that we're inclusive? There's justice elements like that. So the sweet spot is the donut, where you're within the planetary boundaries, but you're also meeting these basic social goals we have. And that's a very nice way of summing up sort of the way the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations are framed, where you don't have goals on the environment, and then you have goals on social, and then you have goals on the economy, but that's all integrated. And I think that's how we need to think about it. Now, how does the donut relate to exponential change? Well, it would, in the sense that, I'll give you an example. If you take renewable energy, renewable energies are a typical case for these S curves and exponential growth. Nothing happened for a long time, or nothing visible, but then all of a sudden they reached a point where they just became, in many cases, competitive market-wise, and then they took off like crazy. So that would have the effect that then, you know, a boundary which has been breached on CO2 emissions could then be brought back into the safe space of the donut. So that's how the growth would, or the exponential change would relate to the donut.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Somebody else has asked, is the ideology and philosophy of deep ecology relevant to the issues raised by biodiversity?
Yes, I believe it is, but I'm not deeply enough, no pun intended, familiar with deep ecology to really be speaking on it. But you know, biodiversity is such a it's such a fundamental thing to life on Earth, and you can't have ecology without caring about biodiversity. So it's one of these sort of foundational things. But I would hesitate to speak specifically on the link to deep ecology, because don't know enough about it.
So would I, actually. If anybody does know more, perhaps they can discuss it in their small group and bring it back to us, perhaps. And a comment or a question from Paul, actually. Some of us will be more scared about the ecological crisis than others. And I've certainly found that to be true with people I'm talking to. So I wonder how we live with that gap between what we know and think and what we say. How we navigate that, I think. Yeah.
We had a workshop this morning. We lost an important vote we had 3 months ago here in Switzerland for a new CO2 law, and we had a workshop to sort of figure out what we were going to do next. And people were in tears. I mean, people were really in tears, and it was very different. For some people, they had moved on. You know, they have their coping mechanism, and others were just shattered that something was rejected in a referendum. And well, I don't need to tell you about that, but it happens in Switzerland quite frequently. But you know, seeing those emotions, I think one thing is just to be very honest about it and provide space for sharing those kind of emotions. The worst thing is that people shut them up in their bedroom and don't share them with anyone. And then I think a second thing is to recognize that that people are affected very differently by this. It is very different. It's very individual. And then how do we cope with it? Well, personally, for me, two things are important. One is the people I'm with and the people I'm on this journey with, and the support we can give each other, and not feeling that I'm alone against the rest of the world. I mean, that's one of the strongest motivators I think we have as humans. And the second is what I try to point out with these sort of glimmers of hope, not rose-tinted glasses hope, but, you know, where do we have numbers that show that, you know, that we can do something about this? We have agency. So those two things help me personally, but I think it's very different from one person to another. And I think just by listening to each other and talking to each other about these issues, I think we can really help.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. I'm very interested in this referendum. What was the so it was a public referendum about a CO2 law, and the public voted against it. Is that what happened? Gosh.
Yes, 51%. 51% against.
Gosh,
and it wasn't even because of this this issue. It was because on the ballot there were two issues to which farmers felt were just rich urbanites trying to tell them how to do farming, and you know, using less pesticides and things like that. So there was a huge mobilization in rural Switzerland, and 10% of voters said no to, we had 5 issues on the ballot. We like doing these referenda things. So we have 5 issues to vote on, and 10% of the population said no to all 5.
Wow.
So, you know, it wasn't even because of the climate issue. That's what's so frustrating about it.
Yes.
But we'll get over it.
Yeah, I'm sure. But yeah. We've had that kind of narrow vote here, as you know.
So I hear, yeah.
Yes. And 1 or 2 comments before we go into breakout groups. Sylvia suggested that we sign a petition addressing both the issues of climate and biodiversity. I think that's what you mean, Sylvia. And it's called healthyplanethealthypeople.org. So that's something to look at. And then Jared said, thank you very much for emphasising the human connections. And it's great to hear your links between the biodiversity loss and climate crisis. And personally, he thinks, and I agree with him, there's a 3rd crisis of cultural, including spiritual loss and the impact of social justice and so on. And he's got, if you look at the chat, it's a very, I'm not sure I can read all this. Well, I can't, it's not very long. But he thinks in terms of integrated nature, culture, heritage, and eco-stewardship, which is INCHES, and also INCHES, Inspiring Christian Holistic Eco-Stewardship. So that nice little acronyms there.
Great.
Christine is quickly asking, me, direct message actually, sorry Christine, will the slides be available? And somebody else has already asked that later.
You're welcome to have them, yes.
Thank
I'm happy
you.
to share them with you.
Thank you. Any other quick question? And I
Deborah,
can't...
we should just give people offer people time in breakout rooms.
All right.
As time
oh
is
yes, of course,
on.
we need time. Right, yes.
So maybe we could have 10 minutes, Barbara, just so we can, is that all right? So we can sort of get back on track. And I posted in the chat some questions which might just help to help you chew on what you've heard and the thoughts that it's triggered in your head. So Thomas is welcome to sort of amplify these, but firstly, you'll be in a group with people who, well, you'll have to find out, won't you? Introduce yourself and just say hello. Share a bit of your interest and why you're here. And then secondly, as people of faith, what are we called to do in response to this? You know, just, and it could be at any level that you want to respond. I'm very taken by Thomas's table of domains of response, if you like, across those different themes and at different levels. And that strikes me as a really good way of sort of just reflecting on your own life. Secondly, the next question, how can we share what we've learned tonight? So in your church, maybe more broadly in the community, or in the sort of choices that you make, I suppose, as well. What kind of hope would be inspiring but realistic? And Thomas is inviting us to find that sweet spot, as he calls it, where people are themselves inspired for action, but are not dissuaded or discouraged by what seems to be the evidence. And I'm very interested personally in how people square that. So how would you find that hope and communicate that hope that's inspiring but realistic? Is that anything you want to add, Thomas, before we scramble everybody?
No, those are evening filling discussions.
They are.
On each of those questions. They're great.
And you've got 10 minutes. So when you come back, everybody, we'll just have a moment of quiet, maybe a couple of minutes, a bit of bird song. And please, in those 10 minutes, sorry, those minute or two, just type in your own reflections that you brought back out of the breakout rooms. And Thomas and I will kind of, we'll chew them over together, all of us, and perhaps Thomas would like to pick up on a few of the comments that are fed back. So please do supply some material for that when you come back. So Barbara, press the magic button. I'll see you in a bit.
Right, okay.
I'll just make a start before I hand over to you. Steve, if you've got anything you want to react to, just a thank you, particularly for the that grid, as people called it. I've seen a number of comments now, just appreciating how useful that is as a way of understanding how we live. And as I posted in the chat earlier, it's a really useful tool for self-reflection, particularly for anyone who lives by a rule of life, which many people here do, whether you're a member of the Third Order or the Green Christian way of life, which is a kind of like a community under a rule as well. So it's perhaps something we should each do once a year, is to sit down with that table that you have. So thank you for that. Is there anything that you'd like to pick up on in the chat? Let's start.
Well, first maybe on the grid. I used to be a consultant in a previous life, so whenever I think about something, it inevitably ends up with a grid or a 2x2 matrix or something. That's just the way my brain has been hardwired. But it helps me to think through things, and don't take that as you can play around with the levels or the fields in that. But I'm glad if that's helpful. No, I thought I'd pick up on. Thought it was interesting that one group, Deborah wrote that we talked about the difference between dominion and domination. So I think it is interesting, and someone in my group said, where do we start? Well, maybe by going back to scripture. And I think engaging with scripture and rereading some of the passages we think we know so well, and paying attention to them with this sort of aspect of relationship between us and kindred creation can be really helpful. And going back to individual words and noticing and wondering, little things like fact that humans in the first creation story don't even get a day of their own, right? We're there with the land animals. Does that tell us something? Well, maybe, but so it's interesting, I think, engaging and going back to scripture.
Yeah, and as we reflected in our group, there's a lot of lost ground to recover because of that, and the criticism that sprang from the 1970s, really, about Christianity being complicit in the ecological crisis. Anything else that we can pick up on? I think I just want to thank Peter in our little group for describing Wild About Campsie Ash, which is a little project in. Maybe Peter, you'd like to tell us just a little bit about it. But what came through for me is just the sheer. This is a little group in a local village that whose purpose for existence is simply to love the local wildlife. Would you just tell us a bit about it, Peter?
Yeah, it's not in any way linked to the church. It's just that there are one or two people involved who are Christians and do go along to the churches, local churches. It's simply, I think one of our group was inspired by some villages who do have this idea of devoting part of each garden to wildlife. Things like log piles and ponds and pollinating plants and that sort of thing, and then linking all the gardens up in some way so that it becomes a kind of village nature reserve. I think that was the inspiration, and so that's what we're encouraging everyone in the village to do, and possibly create taking over some derelict land which we can turn into a nature reserve as well. But from a Christian point of view, what I was keen to see happening, or pleased to see happening, was that it's not just a church thing and inward looking. It's actually outward looking, and it's a way of relating to the community. So it can improve community cohesion as well as have an effect on increasing biodiversity, or at least reducing its decline.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, it seemed a great example of how a community can pull together and create that sort of reconnection that you were talking about, Thomas.
I think that's a great example, and there's a real risk that we sometimes sort of downplay the importance of such local actions. That's why, you know, that I put that in this community action box, the middle one. I think it's incredibly important because, as you said, Peter, at the end of the day, it's not the individual garden, but it's linking up those individual gardens and creating a sort of a linked up ecosystem that makes it valuable, and so it's ecologically valuable. At the same time, it gives you that sense of community, and I'm not alone in this fight, and which is so important. So I think couldn't stress that enough, how important that is. I'd also just like to point out something here which might be worth considering. You know, also for church groups, you know, can you take people out into nature and have conversations with them about what nature means to them? And we used to do that as we still do as WWF. We have nature walks, we go out with people, but we do it scientifically. We tell them about all the species they can see and so on. That's all great. We did that at night as well, night walks. And, you know, we taught them about the bats and all that. And the people leading those excursions came back and they were almost frightened because they said people like had all these existential thoughts about, you know, you're out in the woods at night. It raises the odd question about, you know, who am I and what's my relationship with the universe around me? And they couldn't cope with that because it was just like they wanted to talk about the species, and the people were out there just having all these sort of spiritual experiences. So again, there's a void there, which, you know, be really interesting for a church group to take on something like that and say, let's go out into nature and see what it does to me and what it does to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, a number of us here, I think, have been involved in forest church and things like that, but there's a lot we can do at that kind. I think time is ticking on. Is there anything else finally that you wanted to pick out, Thomas, or shall we move on to for reflections to close?
Oh, there's so much here.
There is. It's wonderful.
You should try and save this if you can in the chat. It would be a shame to lose this if that's in any way
do
possible.
They'll do that anonymously, just to save everybody's blushes. But yeah, you're right. We've literally, I can tell from what people have contributed that we've only just taken a bit of it. Let's sort of round off by inviting people who are representing Green Christian and Third Order to say, well, where might we take this from here? As we have literally just got the ball rolling, what might be the next steps? So perhaps I should hand over first to Jenny from the Third Order. Jenny, would you like to give us a reflection on next steps for the Franciscans?
Well, I think we have a couple of ways of contacting, hopefully, all our members. And that is, we have monthly, what we call news flashes, which are compiled by one of our members, Jan Benvey. And this gives information about things that are happening now, or workshops or webinars that are coming up, articles that have been particularly useful. And we also have an excellent quarterly review that goes out to everybody, which is edited by another of our members, and Pat Mossop. And that has got articles on creation, on justice, and on peace. So we're trying to continually encourage and empower the members to stay involved and to contribute as far as they can to sort of spread the word, both using discussion in their local groups, because we all belong to local groups, but also to have an input into local churches, such as encouraging people to get their church to register with A Rocha for the Eco Church project, which does both obviously work on climate action, but also on biodiversity. So it's very much about encouraging and empowering people to get involved, to be concerned, and to be able to express those concerns both within the order, but also outside it. We do like people to be able to join other organizations like Friends of the Earth, Extinction Rebellion, WWF, so that they also are supporting other organizations that are involved in these sorts of issues. So it's not just a question of trying to do things within the third order, but through all our local churches, but also through other, shall we say, secular organizations that are involved in concern over the same sorts of issues, because they're so important. One of the things we've been concentrating on lately is looking across at the other provinces of the third order, the problems they've had in the Pacific Ocean with whole islands just being submerged under rising sea levels due to climate change, and also supporting indigenous communities who have been the effective guardians of forests for generations and generations, and who are so threatened by, shall we say, overzealous industrial agriculture, felling forests, deforestation, depriving them of their lands. There's been so many terrible things that have happened in various parts of the world where indigenous peoples have been virtually wiped out, as Thomas's slide showed that was happening in the Amazon. But it's not just there, it's also in Central America, where they try to defend against excessive mining, which can be polluting and so damaging of local economies. So we do try to give a wider perspective as well as just sort of UK concerns.
Yeah.
So we try to combine both individual, third order, churches, the country, and the world at large, because we have to look at this with a wide lens as well as just with a personal one.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think that's something that as churches generally, because we're often worldwide institutions that we belong to, I'm sure there's something we can do to harness that worldwide reach as well. Thank you very much. I guess I'm pretty sure Barbara will want to add to the list of organisations people could join. Green Christian as well. But over to you, Barbara. Although we do have quite a lot of joint members already, sort of overlapping. So,
I'm one of them. I'm one of them. Usually.
Good for you, Barbara. You'll have to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Very briefly, two things to say. One is we've just launched our new visual presentation, Why Faith Matters, at COP26. And if you've had a look at it, you'll have seen that we are very much combining both nature and climate justice. There are 4 themes we selected that we thought the decision makers needed to be looking at COP: nature, climate justice, trade and consumption, and hope. But nature and climate really go together. It's a climate and ecological crisis. We'll be using this presentation widely in the next couple of months. We're getting it to MPs, and we also want to spread it widely amongst churches, our members and others. So that's a resource for you to use too, combining these 2 issues that we're looking at tonight. Second, very quickly, we have a follow-up workshop to tonight, fortnight from now on Wednesday, be a more informal discussion, picking up on a lot of the ideas that you've come up with tonight, both Thomas and the other people who participated. So keeping the chat is a very good idea. So we'll have another hour, which will be an hour, to look at these ideas and tease them out a bit more.